All right. Welcome to my session. My name is Iris Claesson, and I'm going to be talking about money. Azure on a shoestring, 25 hacks for managing costs. This is for solo, small, and medium-sized organizations, companies, and enterprises, because that's what I have experience with. My name is Iris Claesson, and if you want to get a hold of me, you can find my blog, irisclaesson.com. I write mostly about .NET technologies and Azure. And my Twitter handle and all my social media handle is Iris Claesson. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I'm an author and a speaker, and most importantly, I'm a software developer at Construct, and I am a mom to 3-month-old Luca, and this is the first time I'm away, so I'm very nervous. Fun fact about me is I'm a clinical dietitian and personal trainer. I don't practice anymore, but that's what I used to do in a previous life, and then I decided to learn programming instead, and ta-da, here I am. All right, so I mentioned that I work at Construct. Construct is a startup in Gothenburg, Sweden. The startup scene in Sweden is quite big. You have companies such as Skype, which was acquired by Microsoft, is Swedish, and you have Spotify, you have Dice, and you have many other companies. So Sweden is good with startups, and I work at a company that manages or lets companies do organizational planning and data consolidation across multi-dimensional data. So those spreadsheets, those massive piles of spreadsheets that a company will usually use to, for example, do their data-driven budgeting or prognosis and so on, that they will pass around in their departments and try to consolidate at the end. We do that online, in the cloud, with identity and access management and a few more things. So I've been working there for a few years, so it's quite a large system. This is just a sort of scaled-down drawing of the system itself. The drawings are mine, by the way. And we have about 15 services and a variety of tools, and it's partly hosted on Azure and partly hosted with a local cloud provider. When I joined the team, it was an on-premise solution. So a company that was interested in our solution, they would install it on their own service. They had overhead, operational costs, licenses, and all those things. We wanted to make it easier to manage our system, and we also wanted to make sure that we could offer a better price. So we went to the cloud. And it was the first time we ever done that, and it was the first time for me I've done that at such a scale, and I learned quite a few things about cost management. Because nobody in my team is really good with finances. We're all technical people. So basically a bunch of nerds got together, and now we have a product that works really well. I also have my own consultancy company, and I've had different types of customers, and I've always used Azure for resources and services. And I've learned a few things about cost management. And I managed to put together a list with 25 quite handy hacks or tips for how you can get more for less. And I'm going to, in 54 minutes, I'm going to try to cover them all. So this is going to be quite dense. So I'm getting ready for this now. There are in particularly 5 areas that I've grouped this advice in, though. So you have the payment, everything that has to do with payment. That's usually where you start if you want to save money. And then how you choose your resources, how you manage your resources, and the way you can monitor your spending, and also how you manage your development. So let's talk about payment. In regards to payments, there are 4 things that you would probably want to do, and one of them is estimate the cost beforehand. You want to consider Azure reservations, Microsoft programs, and of course the famous enterprise agreement. So let's talk a little bit more about estimating costs. On Azure, there's a pricing calculator, which I hope most of you are familiar with. In this presentation, I haven't added links, because I know it's pretty easy to find this stuff, so you'll be able to find it. The pricing calculator lets you combine different types of resources, and you can set the different options for them, and then you can compare the different estimates. This is really, really handy. However, there are also third-party tools that you can use for estimating costs. Just for comparison, I had AzurePrice.net, which is mostly used for virtual machines. Because if you've ever used a pricing calculator, you might have noticed that the drop-down for example, the virtual machine gets really, really, really long. There are a lot of virtual machines setups that you can choose between, and it can get a little bit overwhelming and difficult to see what you need. The AzurePrice.net, for example, because there are other tools as well, it lets you apply filters and do searches, and in that way you can find which type of virtual machine is best for you. So the pricing calculator is really neat. Of course, you have the documentation as a help when you in regards to virtual machines and all the other resources, but I'm not going to cover in detail which virtual machine you should select. If you have questions in regards to that, you can ask me afterwards, and I'm happy to help you. So on the pricing calculator, you might have seen, maybe not when you've used it, but maybe you've seen it in the slide, that under billing options, you can see that you have something called reserved instances. So usually with Azure, most people are familiar with the pay-as-you-go, where you buy a resource and you pay as you go as you use it. But you can also reserve instances. This only applies to virtual machines, SQL database compute, as well as Cosmo DB. So you can basically reserve an instance. If you know upfront how much you need or what you need, then you can reserve an instance 1 to 3 years and slice the costs additionally. And the difference can be quite big. It can be up to 50%, and it says here up to 72%. In my experience, it's mostly around the 50% mark for a 3-year reserved instance. Now, with our system, we have quite unpredictable workloads, but we do have some things that have predictable workloads, such as all the machines that we use for building and testing, our build machines and so on. So for those, we can use reserved instances. So Microsoft programs is also something I hope people are considering. We did that very late. So we were a part of the BizSpark program, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist anymore. I think it was consolidated together with Azure Accelerator into, Microsoft Accelerator into Microsoft Ventures, and this story there. So you don't have the BizSpark program anymore, but you do have the Microsoft programs for startups. And there are a few requirements. We don't qualify anymore for this because we're not in Series A phase. But it has to be a B2B startup, less than 5 years in existence, and there are also some requirements in regards to annual revenue and funding. So as a startup, you get quite a few things. These are just some of the technical benefits that you get, but you also get help with the business planning and go-to-market planning and a few other things as well. So this is just a few things. You get a lot of free Azure Cloud for 2 years. You get also a Visual Studio Enterprise Cloud subscription and also the enterprise-grade Azure support, which we have, and that is gold. That is really gold. I have to say, I'm very impressed with Azure support. Now, if you're a student, and I do a lot of talks at various schools, I'm very interested in talking to students and get more people to learn programming. And Microsoft has a very good program for students. However, to qualify, you have to be attending a 4-year degree granting education. And that means that you can't use like online courses, like mock courses and so on. That's not going to be enough. And full-time student in a STEM-related field. So some of the benefits is $100 credits for 12 months. So that means that each year you can reapply and get another 100. And there's also a selection of free services, which I'm going to cover later in this talk. Otherwise, you have the famous enterprise agreement, which I'll be honest with you, I don't know too much about because we definitely don't have 500 users or users, employees or devices in our company. We're quite small, we're about 20 people. But the monetary savings with enterprise agreement can be between 15 and 45%, and you also get additional things such as software assurance and these similar packages. So this is the payment part. Once you've decided on which resources or sort of which resources you're interested in, the next step is actually choosing or selecting your resources. And there are quite a few things that you can do here to further lower your costs. And we learned this the hard way, so I'm going to tell you a few stories. First of all, you want to pick the right service, the right region, Consider elastic pooling, auto-scale. You can combine with other providers, and there is also support for static hosting. So let's talk about picking the right service or the right tool. So when we decided to move everything to the cloud, we basically just did a lift and shift. So we took what we had and just moved our virtual machines to the cloud as is. So we had virtual machines where we installed SQL Server ourselves and had the license cost and operational costs with that. And we managed everything ourselves. Instead of using the actual resources, we could have used Azure SQL, for example, which we did further down the line, and the difference in price was quite big. I will, however, cover a little bit later how you can reuse existing licenses with a hybrid solution. So, in regards to picking the right service, you want to start small and scale later. And I'm going to cover a few things how you can avoid under-provisioning as well as over-provisioning. And you want to consider all the different options that there are there. So there are so many services that you can use on Azure. For example, if you want to do messaging, you don't have to set up your own machine with the messaging tool or service and manage everything. So I would definitely consider that. Now, this is something not a lot of people are too aware of. So regions are really important. And regions will decide what type of resources are available to you within that region and also what the cost is going to be. So cost between regions can differ significantly, and I don't know if people have noticed that. So I just picked 3 random regions comparing North Europe, West India, and East Asia. And this was for a virtual machine with, I think it was, let's see, how many cores? It was the previous one I had earlier. Oh, there is, actually have it on the slide. So it's 8 cores, 28 gigabytes of RAM. And this is the price difference. So in North Europe, it was like $670 US. West India, closer to 800. And then East Asia, which is one of the more expensive regions at the moment, it was about 900. Now, you want to be aware that you can't just select a region based on price, because not all services are going to be available in all the regions. And there is a search, a product availability by region search that you can use to double check that those products that you're interested in are available in that region. And also, if you use the reserved instances, the difference is not going to be as big. So that's, if you're going to use reserved instances, you don't really need to price pick a region. And the site I talked about earlier, the AzurePrice.net, also does a region comparison, but I found it to be a little bit unreliable, so I didn't have a screenshot of that here. Now, I talked about under-provisioning and over-provisioning. There's something called elastic pools and also something called auto-scale. These are 2 ways that you can manage your resources so you don't under or over provision, and at the same time that you can have a set price. So if you do large-scale planning like we do and calculations, and you have an unpredictable workload, and you have utilization spikes that differ between databases, you can use something called elastic pooling. Then you can have a set price, and then the databases will use whatever they need, and the rest goes back to the pool. The same thing goes for virtual machines. For example, if you use scale sets with virtual machines, you can set a minimum and a maximum, and in that way we'll have elasticity and horizontal scaling within your virtual machines. Let's not forget that you can combine with other providers. So our setup is actually, some of it is in Azure, and some of it is with a local cloud provider for a variety of reasons. We also have our own machines. For my own, I guess, private setup for my company, I also use a variety of providers combined with Azure. I have all my databases hosted somewhere else. And you can combine with other providers. There's no rule that says you have to have absolutely everything on Azure, and nobody's going to be upset if you compare with competitors and you end up selecting something else. So you can combine with other providers, and a lot of the resources on Azure has connectors, so you can easily connect in other providers as well. If you do hosting, now static hosting is quite popular nowadays. I'm not a terribly big fan of that. I don't have a static site myself, but static hosting is something that also Azure supports. So if you have, for example, a static site or static sites that you want to host, Azure has support for that, and that's definitely going to carry much lower costs. And I'll get back to this when I talk about storage tiers, not tires. See my English, tiers. All right, okay, all right, it understood me. Excellent. All right, so let's talk about managing your resources. Because now we talked about payment and how you choose your resources. When you manage your resources, there are a few things that are really important to think about, and one is deleting things, keeping an eye out for unused virtual hard drives, deallocating, auto shutdown, and storage tiers. Delete what you don't use. So this is an interesting story. So a while back ago, I just noticed that our costs were just skyrocketed. And turns out that everybody in my team has admin access to the portal. You should never do that with developers. Because you go in there and go like, oh, I want to try this. Click, 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 click. And I found so many virtual machines that were just lying around. And the thing is, if you have them around for long enough, nobody is going to want to touch them, because nobody knows if they're in use, and nobody wants to be the person that accidentally deletes a production machine. There was a company that did that not too long ago, and they live streamed trying to recoup all the data. So yeah, if you leave things around for too long, then they're not going to get deleted, because people are going to be too scared to actually remove them. And the problem with deleting your resources is, first of all, when you create something as, for example, a virtual machine, I find this as a really good example, it's not just one resources, you get a bunch of them. So the list you see there, that's just the beginning of the list, and this is for a virtual machine, and that's just the start of the list of all the resources created in the background. And there is no easy way to delete all of them, unless when you create your resources, you use, for example, you can use a subscription to group, you can use tags to group, you can use resource groups to group. Keep your groups very, very neat and small and very scoped, and that makes it a little bit easier when you want to delete resources, because that also enables you to actually automate it. So the two problems you have with deleting resources is, one, identifying the ones that you can delete, and two is delete the orphaned resources. And I'm going to show you a little bit how you can do that. So in terms of identifying unused resources, usually I go by resource group. So I will sort by resource group, and I'll go through a resource group. Here's an example. So I just finished writing a book on ASP.NET Core. Should be out in May, migrating to ASP.NET Core. And for that, I have a resource group for that particular book. So when I'm done with the book, I can just delete everything within that resource group. That's pretty neat. You can also use tags, and I'll get to that a little bit later, how you can use tags. I also look at the billing, so billing per resource type. And if I see something that looks very static, it might be an indication that it's just something lying around costing me money that I'm not actually using. In regards to deleting orphaned resources, those can be really hard to locate. But if you export your ARM template, which you do under automation script, and then you can just download the template, you will get a beautiful little file, or quite large file with JSON, that you can upload to, for example, a third-party tool such as ArmWiz, and you can get a diagram. This is not the prettiest diagram, but when I did this, I did this just to take this screenshot, and I noticed that there's this little lonely resource up there, and I zoomed in on it and it says cogserve test. So for me, everybody has a naming convention when they create their console applications or whatever, you know. Me is adding test or temp at the end. And that's how during my annual deletes of started projects that I forgot about, I'll just delete everything that has a test in the name. So I guess that's one way you can delete your resources. And that's how I located this one. And this one has been costing me money, but I haven't been using it. It was just lying around. All right, so delete unused virtual hard drives. It's very common to have hard drives lying around, virtual ones, that are not being used. And one way to locate them is by using the Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer. And I'm going to talk about the storage emulator later that you can use for development, but you can connect your emulator to the Storage Explorer as well and also use it to explore your emulated Azure storage. But the Storage Explorer, nonetheless, you can take a look at the different virtual hard drives that you have there. And if it doesn't have a disk name and it's not tied to a VM name or even have a disk type, then this might be an indication that it's not being used. Always back up, don't just blindly delete, because you might have an accident that's not going to be too fun. And then there's the deallocation. So I'm still surprised how many people are not aware of that. If you just stop a virtual machine, you're not necessarily deallocating. It depends on how you stop the virtual machine. And if you're not deallocating, it's going to continue to cost you money because it's going to be there in the background and it's going to take that allocated space. So the way you stop and deallocate a virtual machine is from within the Azure portal, or for example, using one of the PowerShell commandlets or the command line tools available to you. But if you're just in the virtual machine and you shut down the virtual machine from inside the machine, I don't know why you would do that, but if you accidentally did that, that's not going to deallocate your machine and it's still going to cost. One way to avoid this is by using the auto shutdown feature. This is really nice to have. And if you have a machine that doesn't have to be, that you don't have to have running 24/7, use it. I'm going to also give you another option, by the way, besides this one. But the auto shutdown feature is really neat. So you set the time and also the time zone, and you can also send notifications before it shuts down. This can be quite neat, in particular in the beginning, if you're unsure of what time is the best time for you to automatically shut it down. I would always combine the auto shutdown together with budget alerts, which I'm going to talk about very soon, or some type of alerts, because you want to be notified in case something happens. Because something happened to me, and I noticed this, was it yesterday? Yes, yesterday, when I was adding some more screenshots to the slides, I noticed that I had incurred some rather high costs because the virtual machine had not shut down. And I'm going to tell you that story very soon. But before I get into more of the monitoring part of your spending, I just want to mention the storage tiers. I just want to say tires. I don't know why I want to say tires, but tiers. So some words are really hard for me to say, like thesis, anything with a th sound. So storage tiers, you have a variety of them. You want to make sure that you select the right one. If you have data that is not very frequently accessed, go for cool storage or even an archive storage. So this is one way, because obviously there are different prices attached to these different tiers. All right, trying to speed this up a little bit so I can cover absolutely everything. Monitoring spending, this is the fun part. And this is the part I'm not very good with because I'm a programmer. I don't care too much about the financial part or the organizational part of software development. I like to write code. However, we've all had to learn a thing or two about monitoring spending, for we are a startup and we don't have as many resources, monetary or human resources, as we would like to have, and therefore we need to keep an eye out for our costs. And there are a few ways that you can do that, and I'm going to talk about subscriptions and tags to create your own little groups for analyzing later, how you create a budget, and also how you have billing alerts. So when we first moved to Azure, this was many years ago, and back then I didn't have the cost analysis part of Azure, which is quite new. But what we did when we set up our subscriptions, you can have several subscriptions for your account. And this is just an example. So the numbers here are just an example. We do have a higher budget than 200 Swedish kronor, which is like 20 euros. So we created subscriptions for the different parts of our development environment. So we had a subscription for development, we had a subscription for quality assurance, we had one for acceptance testing, and one for production 1, production 2, and the beta track. So we had different subscriptions for all our different environment parts, so we can see the spending per area. And of course, within that subscription, we would have our resource groups and later on also groups by tags. And that helps when you want to analyze your spending. With the tags, however, there are some limitations. It's not too terrible limitations. You can't have more than 15 per resource or group. There's a character limitation, and also it's not available for all the resources. However, there is, again, a search, so you can look up the different Azure resources and see if it supports tags. So make sure you do that if you're going to rely very heavily on tags. And tags are really useful for a lot of things, not just for monitoring costs. So what do you do with these tags? Well, if you go to the cost analysis blade, you can get some very pretty diagrams, very useful, like even people like me can understand them, which is like a low point. But you can select granularity and you can select filter and quite a few other things, and you can see your spending. And I'm going to show you very soon what I noticed when I did that. So this is really nice, but you sort of want to have something to compare this with, and that's where budget comes in. So besides the cost analysis, you can also create budgets and you can apply these budgets. When you create a budget, you tie an alert to it, and I'm going to show you that very soon. So I didn't have any screenshots of this, so I was working on creating the screenshots for this session. So I just set a random budget for my own personal subscription, which I use for my blog. So not my company subscription, but just for my blog and my personal budget. Not a lot of money. It's like 100 euros, whatever. And then I applied it. And as soon as I did that, I see a notification there. And apparently I'm already over budget. And I was like, how is this even possible? Well, turns out that in my book resource group, I had a virtual machine that did not shut down when I thought it had. And it had been running 24/7 for about 5-6 months, and I didn't know that. I had billing alerts, but these were very old billing alerts, and they weren't working anymore. And I had no idea until I applied this budget, and I saw it turned red. So I'm currently talking with support about this. So this was an unpleasant surprise for me. So I highly recommend that create a budget, even if it's just a very simple one, and enable alerts. So billing alerts are very nice to have, and you can create different types of billing alerts. Now, the alert conditions is basically, as you can see, you can set different types of alert conditions. So I set one on 80% of my budget. That's good enough. And I just added my email, and then I applied it. And then when you receive an alert, you're going to get a notification. You can see it in the portal, as well as you will receive a notification for example, the email address that you added. And there are other types of alerts that you can have in addition to the budget alerts. And I'm going to talk about them very soon. Now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things soon, and that's Azure Monitor, and more in particular about application insights. When you do your development, there are a few things that you can do to further lower your costs. And the things I'm going to talk about now are Azure Monitor, DevTest Labs, free trials, as well as the storage emulator. So Azure Monitor has become like a central point for doing various things, such as getting insights into your data. It has visualization tools. It has analysis tools, different response options. such as actions and alerts. And you also have different types of integrations. And the integrations are when you want to get really advanced. What I've used the most is, you can't see that too well. I'm sorry about that. I wasn't sure about the lighting. Well, I've used Application Insights a lot. So for all our resources, we have a separate Application Insights resource that we use to track different types of metrics, including our logging as well. It might not seem very intuitive to use, for example, exception tracking or metrics on errors and exceptions to lower your cost, but any unnecessary amount of data and actions that are happening in your system is going to cost you money. So here's an example where I'm using some of the built-in features in Azure, the log search. You can't really see the blade there, and that's sad. So I'm going to explain what's happening here in case you can't see it too well, because I think the light is a bit bad. But we're doing a query across all our different resources, and then we are just filtering on the item type exception. And there's a blade to the left, which is the filter blade, which is currently in preview, that will suggest some automatic filters that you can apply to further filter down your result. So in this screenshot, it says that it has 29 exceptions within the time range of last 24 hours that are to our authentication endpoint, more particularly for one of our XAML authentication services. And that's not good. I don't want to have exceptions when it comes to the authentication part. If I select that filter, which is on the operation name, and then I apply and run it, what happens is that it applies that filter and it runs the query again, and now I have more data. And I can also see that every single exception seems to stem from the exact same method, which actually turns out to be an error in a third-party library that we are using for our XAML authentication that doesn't support a chained response assertions. It took me about 2-3 minutes to go through this and locate the error, fix it, and also deploy a bug fix. So I don't know if you're familiar with Custo, which is the Azure Log Analytics search language, something. It's called Custo. And it has very good support for machine learning. So it has some built-in sort of machine learning functions that you can use. I do not know much about machine learning, but I do sort of think I know what auto-cluster is. It will automatically find discrete patterns, and it will find some groups with similar patterns, and will show you the result. So here again, this time I'm not going across all our resources. I'm just looking into 2 of our services, our calculation and aggregation engine together. And I'm just looking at API calls that were unsuccessful. And then I'm just calling the evaluate autocluster function. And I can see there are 3 groups, and there are 2 in particular that I'm interested in, because there seems to be a lot of unsuccessful calls that have the same user ID and the same session ID, and also the same operation ID. So that immediately gives me something to look at. So you have all these type of functions that you can use. And what you can do with all these results, and I don't have a screenshot of that unfortunately, but what you can do with all these results is you can pin them to a dashboard and you can share that dashboard. We have several dashboards for different environments and so on, but what you should be aware of in regards to the Azure dashboards is that they don't refresh very often. It depends on what type of query you do, but some of them will only refresh on an hourly basis. So it's not that it doesn't have a good refresh rate, but it will still give you a very good overview. So we have queries where we can see all the errors and all the exceptions and a variety of things. And every day before stand-up, we'll go to our dashboard and we'll take a look at it. And this has helped us optimize our system a lot. So while the exceptions themselves don't cost a lot, it is an indication of places where we can improve our system, and we have gotten much better performance and reliability with our system by using Azure Monitor. And there are other things, there are so many metrics that you can collect. You can also collect performance metrics. And for example, here, I think I'm looking at CPU usage. Yep, process CPU on all cores. And what you can do is you can create alerts or rules with a tied action to them based on the different metrics. We've used webhooks a lot because we used webhooks together with Slack, so we've integrated the notifications there, as well as also some services to generate reports and so on that we can take a look at on daily basis. So this is just a very, very, very little slice of everything that Azure Monitor has to offer. But in my opinion, this is it's easiest to get started with, because application insights, I think a lot of people are already familiar with and already using. And it will provide you a lot of the metrics that you need to analyze your spending. All right, DevTest Labs. So I talked about the auto shutdown. Before the auto shutdown was added to virtual machines, I believe it was first added to the DevTest Labs. So DevTest Labs is a way that you can set up environments for your developers by specifying allowed number of machines. You can also specify allowed machine size. The one I had that cost me so much money, I also used for rendering. And rendering can get really, really expensive. So if you want to make sure that your developers don't go crazy, you can also set the machine size. You can set virtual machines per lab and also set an expiration date, which I highly recommend that you do, but also make sure that the developers know about the expiration date. There is really good cost tracking. I'm not going to go into detail in regards to the cost tracking, but there's a lot of cost tracking that you can do. And you can group and filter in the same way that we did in the cost analysis blade. The automatic shutdown is really neat. What's even neater, I reckon, is the auto start. Because I don't know if you've tried stopping and deallocating a virtual machine and then starting it again. Sometimes it can take a little while. And if you come to work and you're eager to get started, obviously you want to have your environment ready. I'm a big fan of having a cloud-based development environment. It makes it so much easier to provision the environment to new employees, as well as just basically getting a fresh start. Because all the environment details that you set up together, all the resources, you can export the ARM template, you can save the ARM template, and you can reuse it. And that works really well with DevTest Labs. So if you use virtual machines for your own personal development, have a look at DevTest Labs and see if that's something that could be for you. There's also a lot of free stuff. So when you set up an account with Azure, you get $200 credit, Azure credit. And you have 12 months with a selection of free services, and you have well over 25 free services. I'm not going to cover absolutely all of them because there are so many. Here are just two screenshots of some of the products that are available. So there are two groups. So there is a group of services that are free for 12 months when you sign up for Azure. And then there are products that are always free. So these are more like you have free trials, so there will always be some restrictions. I've used cognitive services a lot. The free trials there are awesome. Those are for 7 days, I believe, but you get X amount of REST calls that you can do for translation, text recognition, and a few other things. So if you go to the documentation, you can get the full list of the free products as well as the ones that are always free, not with a 12-month limitation. And this is the slide I talked about when I talked about what students get access to. All right, continuing and talking about development. The Azure Storage Emulator. I wish I'd known about this earlier. Actually, when I did local development, I would test against our actual Azure storage. We even had some accidents, unfortunately, but with the help of support, I was able to recover some of the lost data. But we did development using Azure Storage because we weren't aware of the emulator. There is an Azure Storage emulator that you can use. You install it on your computer, and it's basically a command line driven tool. But you can hook up the Azure Storage emulator with the Storage Explorer if you want to have a UI and you want to be able to find out what's inside your storage. It will, per default, use a local Express SQL instance, but if you have a full-fledged installation on your computer, it will go ahead, you can configure it to use that instead. So what it does is, obviously, it emulates Azure Storage, but because it's an emulation and not an actual implementation, it comes with some limitations. And the list is quite long, actually, but here are some of the things that I thought were a little bit more significant, such as the max blob size, 2 gigabytes. No SMB protocol support, and also the max row size is 1 megabyte for tables. But the Azure Storage Emulator is really handy to use. So when you install it, it will show up in your notification tray, and there's a menu you can use there to start and stop it, as well as you can use the command line tool. And there are a few things that you can do to query the actual emulator itself. These were the development-related cost-saving tips. And there are 2 other things that I want to talk about. And I mentioned the hybrid option. So there's something called Azure Hybrid Benefits. This basically lets you use your on-premise license, and you can run virtual machines, Windows virtual machines on Azure, and you can do that at a reduced cost. So if we bring up that calculator again, and for the same virtual machine I looked at earlier, with a reserved instance as well as the benefits option, I get a 78% discount. That is quite significant. I've sliced costs quite a lot. And even if I hadn't reserved the instances, say that I want to use pay-as-you-go, you can still use Azure Hybrid Benefits. There's this calculator, and there's another calculator. There's the Azure Hybrid Benefits Savings Calculator that you can use to get more in-depth information about the amount of money that you can save. So, well, in-depth and in-depth. Basically, if you look at this is just a slice of the pricing calculator, but you get a better overview. So, look at that. And for the final piece of advice that I want to give you, that's for the rest, use REST. So, if you dream of bigger and better things, there are third-party tools, and they all rely on the different REST APIs that Azure has. You have the billing APIs and the invoice APIs and a few other things. They're all marked as in preview, but they've been around for a while, and they're stable, but not too well documented, so it can be a little bit of a struggle. That's why I added this at the very last slide. Because if you want to save money, use all the other previous hacks that I mentioned and save this one for last, because this is going to involve the most amount of work and probably have the lowest return. But there are a lot of APIs that you can use to give you more information, as well as third-party tools that rely on those APIs to get more information. Because, as we all know, software development is really hard. We build and we build and we build and we struggle. And all the building blocks cost money. We don't like to think about money, but it still matters how much we spend. And even if you just save a little bit here and a little bit there, in the long run, it makes a quite big difference. This is the full list of the hacks that I covered today. I'm sure there are other ways that you can save money. Feel free to share those with me, and I'll add them to the next talk I do on this topic. And with that said, I've actually managed to go through all the slides, and I have 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. You can ask them out loud. Does anybody have questions here? Or what are your questions? This always happens. People go completely silent. At least you're Dutch and you have facial expressions. In Sweden, people just sit there. And I've also noticed that people sit next to each other. I don't see that much in Sweden, so. Anyways, thank you so much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.